All right. When President Obama visited the UK last week, he caused a lot of headlines talking about what could happen if we vote to leave the European Union. He said the UK could be left at the back of a very long queue. And the comment was widely seen as a boost for the Remain camp. There wasn't that much focus on the trade agreement that President Obama was referring to when he said, look, stick with this whole EU negotiation with us. Now, that negotiation, the trade negotiations at the heart of his statement, is known under the general heading of TTIP. And it is actually quite controversial, both here in Europe and in the USA. Today, Barack Obama and David Cameron are in Hanover, meeting the leaders of France, Germany and Italy to discuss TTIP further. They're the so-called G5. And we thought we should have a look at what the alternative is to Britain getting out of Europe and actually trying to negotiate its own agreement. If we stick with the EU, we stick with TTIP. And our reporter Tim Johns has been finding out what exactly it is.
When President Obama warned us that we could miss out on a vital trade agreement and that
the UK is going to be in the back of the queue,
the media relayed his warnings. But while this weekend's news coverage went big on
the back of the queue,
it didn't really delve into what the trade agreement we could miss out on is, or mention the fact that there are plenty of people who don't even want the agreement in the first place. The proposed deal is called TTIP, which stands for the
Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership.
Perhaps it always receives relatively limited media attention because it's extremely complicated and, some would argue, extremely boring. Even the president sounds like he struggles to muster interest.
our next step is to try to negotiate a EU United States agreement. The TTIP, as it's known.
Make no mistake, there is a huge amount of support for this deal, which would, broadly speaking, lower import and export tariffs. The US is the UK's biggest export destination, and the government says TTIP could make us £10 billion better off a year. However, TTIP, which sounds a bit like a nickname for a rap artist, also faces sizable public opposition.
Public services here to say, TTIP, no way!
In October 2014, there were protests in 15 cities across the UK, and that anger hasn't gone anywhere. And in Germany this weekend, tens of thousands of people pitched out to protest against TTIP ahead of President Obama's visit there. They banged their drums, which is of course mandatory at any protest. Tell us, Mr. Protester, what angers you so?
What this is really about is not about trade in goods, it's about services, and it's about allowing large corporations to bid for government contracts.
Anti-TTIPers say that big American business will be able to bid to run some public sector services here, including parts of the NHS. When Vince Cable was business secretary, nearly 200,000 people signed an online petition which said,
if TTIP passes as it is now, it will enshrine privatisation in our public services.
The petition wording goes on to explain something which is fundamental to many people's opposition to this thing. Pay attention because it really does sound quite dull.
You must push for the investor-to-state dispute settlement mechanism to be removed and for public services, including the NHS, to be exempted from the deal.
The
investor-to-state dispute settlement
would allow companies to sue foreign governments over claims of unfair treatment and to be entitled to compensation. The big worry is that if the government let an American company run part of the NHS but later chose to return that part to the public sector, the American company could sue the government. The protesters have other worries too. They say the US have more relaxed food laws and this could all end up with us importing genetically modified vegetables and so on. They think jobs will be lost. So for the anti-TTIP brigade, if this happens,
the UK is going to be in the back of the queue.
Well, that would be no bad thing.
That was Tim Johns reporting. On Twitter, he's at TimOnCheese. We'll talk about whether we should be more worried about TTIP after this. We are discussing the TTIP deal, and we just had a brilliant package on it from Tim Johns explaining what it's all about. We're going to hear some debate on it now, and how good is this for us, and how good is it for other countries? Those two questions, really. John Hilary is Executive Director of War on Want. He doesn't like TTIP at all. Sam Bowman joins us as well from Westminster, Executive Director of the Adam Smith Institute, who's supportive of TTIP and thinks the scare stories are unjustified. Let's go to you first, Sam. You tell us why TTIP is a good thing.
Well, the US and the EU are the world's two largest, biggest economies. And even though some tariffs remain, these are taxes that we have on imports, the big barriers to trade are to do with regulation. Now, this doesn't mean that regulation is necessarily higher in the EU or lower in the US. It can be things like 3-prong plugs versus 2-prong plugs, driving on the left-hand side of the road or driving on the right-hand side of the road. So in many cases, there are equally robust safety checks on things, but they're completely different. So a seatbelt made in the EU might be just as safe as one that you can sell in the US, but because there are two completely different sets of regulations, you'd have to set up an entirely different production line to do that.
So this just basically streamlines the rules for the purposes of trade between the EU and the USA.
Exactly. It's the same principle as the single market in the EU.
So
really.
John Hilary, what's wrong with it then?
Yeah, that's completely nonsense, because the key thing about TTIP is it's not about, like, the EU raising standards. It's about lowering standards. It's about cutting out all the workers' rights, the environmental standards, the food safety standards. Let me give you just one example of where the US is completely different from the EU. Take beef. In the USA, 90% of all their beef is produced using growth hormones. So the cattle are fed growth hormones, they grow quicker, they can be slaughtered earlier, and it makes them more profitable. The problem is those growth hormones have been shown to be carcinogenic. They cause cancer in humans, and therefore they're banned in the EU. But they're perfectly allowed to be used in the US. And the US are now saying, in TTIP, you've got to drop that ban. We need to be able to sell our beef in, and we don't care if you think it's carcinogenic. And it's those type of food safety rules.
Sam, how do you respond to that?
Well, I don't want to get into a back and forth, since neither John nor I knows the actual detail of TTIP.
Well, you can get into a back and forth, actually, because let's talk about beef.
Well, okay, so
surely it's not in our interest to lose EU regulations on beef.
We won't be. The EU has already come out and said that regulations to do with food safety, regulations to do with antibiotics and things like that will not be changed. EU consumers will not be at risk of eating these kinds of things. But it's actually worth pointing out that in some respects, the US has higher standards than we do. For example, in America, meat that's been treated with antibiotics cannot be labelled as organic. In the EU, it can. So in that respect, the Americans have more strict regulations than us.
Well, that might be a good thing, John, then, for us.
Well, it is true that in certain areas, the US has indeed got better standards. And we look particularly at financial services. After the financial crisis of 2008, President Obama introduced much stricter rules for banks in the US. And it's now the City of London, the Frankfurt banks, the French banks are saying they want TTIP to lower those standards. The key thing is, on both sides of the Atlantic, TTIP is about giving big business better rules and regulations for them, but worse for everybody else.
Let's talk about that side of it, if we can, Sam, because one of the issues is that this gives a comeback to a business that feels it's being treated unfairly by a country with a tariff or a rule or whatever. So the business can effectively sue. Now, we had an example of it in Australia, where the tobacco company Philip Morris put in a huge lawsuit for compensation after they were told that their cigarettes could only be sold in plain packets with shocking health warnings. Do we want to give companies that kind of comeback?
Well, we already do. The UK is already party to 94 of these agreements around the world. And since the 1970s, UK firms have successfully brought 43 cases against foreign governments that were illegally acting against British investors. Now, in that same time, and bear in mind, we're just as open to these responses, the UK has not once been successfully taken to court under one of these agreements. So the idea that this is something new...
John.
The idea... I'm just taking the numbers from the government, John. They might be wrong as well. But the idea that this is something new, this is something that we should be afraid of, it just doesn't bear out with the facts.
It isn't true, because we put in a Freedom of Information challenge, and eventually the government had to agree that it has in fact lost one of these cases in the past, and they have been telling porky pies, I'm afraid, when they've gone out in public. But the key thing on this is that US corporations under TTIP will get, for the first time, their own privileged court system where they can sue us. We can't sue them. No domestic companies can use it. It's only available for them.
What are we worried about, though? Why would we worry about them being blocked?
So, for example, let's say that a future administration decides it wants to re-nationalise the railways, or indeed the NHS, or anything like that. They can immediately be sued by the US corporations, not because the US corporations had a contract, which is perfectly fair. They should be able to sue in that type of situation, but because they had plans to make money in the future. Another example is Germany. Germany has decided to phase out nuclear power and switch to renewables. We'd think that's a very good democratic choice to make. They're now being sued for $5 billion euros by a Swedish company which said we had plans. We were going to make money out of the nuclear industry.
There's a difference between being sued and actually successfully having to pay the money. The point about these is that governments can, at the very most, be forced to pay compensation. They never have to change policy. The democratic will of the people will never be overruled by this. They will have to, if British firms or if American firms are unfairly excluded from markets by new regulations, then yes, governments will have to compensate them for that.
But it's nothing about being unfair. That's the key thing.
It's all about
here.
being fair. It's all about. This is exactly the same principle that the EU single market rules on.
What about, Sam? I know one issue that's come up is the NHS, which apparently has not got any special protection here. And an American company could say, look, we provide brilliant hip replacements in the USA, and you're not giving us a look in because you've got this strange thing about the NHS being national and it's in the government's hands and the people's hands. You need to open up hip replacements to our company.
It's not true that the NHS doesn't have any protections. Both the EU and the US negotiators have explicitly said, they said it in March in 2015, it's on the record, you can look at it, that they will expect to have roughly the same wording that's in the Canadian Free Trade Agreement that the EU is putting through. But you don't have to believe me. The NHS Confederation itself has said, and I quote, "Nothing envisaged in TTIP should change the current situation in the NHS regarding the commissioning of publicly funded healthcare services."
Well, the NHS scares me.
Well,
anyway.
The NHS isn't scared by it. So I think we should listen to them.
Well, maybe, John, maybe it's a good thing if an American company has the right to sue the NHS because it's doing hip replacements too expensively.
I think the people of Britain are absolutely clear. We want to have a national health system which is available for everybody, free at the point of use, and we want it to be delivered in public hands. Everybody says that all the time. The key thing about TTIP, we've seen it in black and white in the published document that we made the EU make public. Health is on the table for negotiation. Education is on the table. Rail, post, all these public services are being given up to the US to be traded away. Now, that's not what we want at all.
This is
We've
just
seen it in
fear-mongering.
black and white. We've seen it in black and white on the thing which was published by the EU last year. So there's no gainsaying that.
Look, you're muddying the waters. There are provisions in TTIP which say that if the NHS wants to open something to private tender, then US firms will be allowed to bid for that as well. That's completely right, and it protects UK investors as well. British investment in the US is large. US investment in the UK accounts for 1 million jobs. Making investment and making trade easier will make us all richer. Households will be £400 better off because of TTIP, and that's something that fear-mongering and tutting at won't change.
Well, it wasn't me tutting, but I'm always suspicious of those any figures like that. Thank you very much to Sam Bowman, Executive Director of the Adam Smith Institute, who likes TTIP, and John Hilary, the Executive Director of War on Want. We've got two Executive Directors here who's against it. You may have your own thoughts on what TTIP will do for us and to us. It's the big trade deal between the EU and the USA. It does give corporations a look in on challenging some of the laws. All right, it's Radio 2. That's sad that he's gone. We're talking about TTIP. We're maybe getting to grasp this for the first time. It's a trade deal between the USA and the EU, and it was referred to by President Obama off the back of that whole sort of mash-up last week over whether Britain would have to go to the back of the queue with the US to negotiate a new trade deal if the UK left the EU. This is what the president said.
I think it's fair to say that maybe some point down the line there might be a UK-US trade agreement, but it's not going to happen anytime soon because our focus is in negotiating with a big bloc, the European Union, to get a trade agreement done. And UK is going to be in the back of the queue.
So at the heart of that soundbite was this idea that TTIP is going on and we're trying to get it sorted. Tony Roberts emails and says, it is the biggest danger, this, to our independence. It takes away our democracy. It allows big businesses to ride roughshod over government decisions and force their business needs over the governments. This is bigger than the EU vote. Really interesting, isn't it? The idea that it gives a business the right to challenge, let's say, a tariff that we put in place. Let's say we wanted to say, okay, we're going to have a tax on steel coming in here because we've got to save our industry at Port Talbot. And then steel makers elsewhere in China can then take a case to reduce that tariff. Paul in Wales emails, the UK-EU food regulations and safety regs are far, far superior to America's. This is all about the USA watering down EU regulations so USA multinationals can then buy up EU companies. Is that right? Nigel Ruttelow is in Skelmersdale. Hi, Nigel.
Hello.
You think this is very suspicious, this deal as well?
Very, very. We're really behind the clock when it comes to big business. America have written a rule book on taking over the business. And I don't know if you remember, several years ago, the banana wars, we were basically told to take bananas from their industries. Basically, banana plantations which had been planted in South American rainforests, where they'd torn down rainforests, and we had to stop buying bananas from the Caribbean that we'd done for centuries, and at the cost of the indigenous population and the indigenous industry there. And we lost the ruling with the World Trade Organization. I had to buy our bananas. But okay, American corporations.
Understood. But if we want to get our goods into the USA, and we've got to accept their rules a bit, haven't we? That's why trade deals have to be done.
Well, I understand that, but like I say, American business, they wrote the rule book, and these trade agreements are not for the benefit of the European Union. They're for the benefit of American business.
All right, thank you very much, Nigel. Thank you. Paul Bond in Grantham says TTIP will see power transferred from governments to corporations, with corporations then having the power to sue the government for millions. Private data, public services, food safety standards, even democracy itself could be threatened by this evil deal. The language is amazing from some of the listeners. Really, some of it is apocalyptic. Adam Smith on Facebook, I think this is not probably the Adam Smith, says when a government follows the will of the electorate and votes to outlaw or stop a practice and a corporation can then sue, that gets dangerous. So he's saying that we can't have a situation where we vote for something and a corporation can challenge it from another country. For example, says Adam, if the UK government decided to ban smoking, then BAT, Philip Morris, Imperial Tobacco, etc., can sue for their lost profits. And that is what TTIP brings to the table.